Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is November 3rd, 2024, Sunday, November 3rd, 2024, and our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled, hold on, yay, here we go, it is titled The Unclaimed Dead. Since 1896, Los Angeles County has been interring the indigent and unclaimed dead. Workers would log each name in large handwritten books. Most of them remained unnamed for years afterward, and some forever, which is kind of sad when you think about it. Anyway, Los Angeles. Ownership of the indigent cemetery, or what was known as Potter's Field, passed from the city to the county of Los Angeles in 1917. And in 1924, with burial space there exhausted, the county began to cremate its indigent deceased. In December 2015, a single grave was dug at the Los Angeles County Cemetery to receive the cremated remains of 1,300 persons who had been sitting on a shelf in the medical examiner's office since 2012. County officials wait 3 years between death and burial to give family members a chance to come forward. But even the most optimistic know that more than likely, once they're in the ground, they'll remain unclaimed and in many cases unnamed forever. In 2015, the records were digitized, which would allow family members a chance to find a loved one even years after their death. There were 1,349 dead, made up of 941 male, 404 female, and 4 unknown. This included 131 babies and 2 teenagers. The majority of the people were over 60 years of age. And by the way, for anybody that wonders who are the 4 unknown, I'm betting that those had to be some type of skeletal remains where they could not even determine from what was left what their sex was. Like maybe no pelvis, nothing that usually gives you a hint, so they were just put into the unknown category. Anyway, in 2016, the number of people was 1,430. In December 2017, the cremated ashes of over 1,500 people that had been waiting since 2014 were buried at Evergreen Cemetery, which is less than a quarter mile from the crematorium. All of them died in nursing homes, hospitals, or the streets across Los Angeles County. The remains were sent to a county crematory in Boyle Heights, where they are reduced to ashes and held for 3 years inside a plastic box. Some of these people had no living relative to come for their remains. Others had lost contact with their family of origin, and others had family that just couldn't afford to pay the county to handle and cremate the body. Only if the death is deemed suspicious is the body autopsied by the coroner, and that office initiates an investigation to find next of kin. 10% remain unnamed and are given the universal surname of Doe. In 2016, a civil grand jury report blamed lengthy backlogs in autopsies and toxicology on underfunding. The ME's office was found to be understaffed and was in danger of losing their accreditation. It's not only this cemetery which holds the unnamed. There are stretches of land that are forgotten, even as burial grounds themselves. This is what was unearthed only a few years ago. Quote, in 2003, construction workers digging a drainage canal for the Playa Vista condo complex unearthed the bones of 396 Gabrieleño Tongva Indians at the edge of the Bayona or Bologna wetlands. The site is now a soccer field. 2 years later, on the other side of town, crews working on the east side extension of the Metro Gold Line found the remains of 174 people, most of them Chinese laborers, just south of Evergreen Cemetery. Some of the graves dated to the 1880s. End quote. One of those who's actually buried at Boyle Heights Cemetery is Greta Meyer. She was an actress and singer known for playing characters such as mothers, landladies, and similar roles in both silent films and early talkies. She was born in Dessau, Germany, and came to the United States as the star of an operetta company, and stayed to pursue an acting career. Her German family was comparable to the Barrymore family in America. She appeared on Broadway in several stage productions. Her last film role was playing Mama Hartzler in the film drama An American Romance, which is from 1944. She passed away in Gardena, California on October 8th, 1965 at the age of 82, and she was cremated and her ashes were buried in the Los Angeles County Crematorium Cemetery in Boyle Heights. The other one is Riata Hoyt. She's another actress who found her eternal resting place at the Los Angeles County Crematorium Cemetery. In 1925, it was reported she was the daughter of Sir Cashon Hoyt, an English diplomat who had died years before and made his home in Johannesburg, South Africa. Her uncle was Colonel Edward George Hoyt of the English Royal Flying Corps. How much of this family history is accurate is unknown. She made her film debut as Betty Stetson in the comedy The Nonstop Bride from 1926. Prior to this, she had appeared in Irving Berlin's Music Box Review and was also part of the Ziegfeld Follies. Her last film was The White Parade in 1934. She married Harry Collins, screenwriter and cinematographer, in 1927, when she was only 14 years old. Many dancers from the Ziegfeld Follies were barely teenagers who lied about their age. By the way, if you all want to check out a book I wrote, which is called The Phantoms of the Follies, I did verify that that was very accurate. Many of these girls that ran off or, just went to join the Ziegfeld Follies and all these, this is the 1920s and things like that, were barely teenagers. So, and of course they lied about their age. And remember, this is the age of the flappers, the real skinny, you didn't have to, they didn't want curves. They kind of wanted those straight lines, so their bodies fit in right in. And by the way, when they would go to try out, like say for example, for Ziegfeld for his Follies, he gave them a list of rules about that they couldn't gain weight, a bunch of other stuff. So the fact that she got married in 1927 when she was 14 years old, that's very accurate. Anyway, let's keep going. They divorced in 1935. So she stayed married for about 7 years or 8 years with this Harry Collins, the cinematographer. Okay, so she divorces him in 1935. Months after her first marriage ended, she married Joseph William Riley in June 1935. Joe Riley was Fox Studios' director of safety, and when their marriage was announced in May 1935, the newspapers listed his age as 36, when in reality he was 54 years old. He was a former detective lieutenant for the New York Police Department and was a technical advisor for Fox Studios. He had led an adventurous life. In 1912, he arrested Nicky Arnstein in Paris, con man and better known as Fanny Brice's husband. Riley had worked on the gang squad and was a bodyguard to Rylander Waldo when he was New York's police commissioner. When younger, he had been a professional boxer under the name of Spike Riley. He had been made a member of Colonel Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders and was a rider in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Despite being 32 years younger than her husband, Riata Hoyt died in 1942 at only 29 years of age from cirrhosis of the liver. Her cremated remains were dumped in a common grave. Her husband, Joe Riley, followed her to the grave 5 years later, but by then he had moved to Florida. For the fanfare she had received when she starred in The Lily, Riata died in obscurity, and not even an obituary appeared in the newspaper. There is no marker for her. Fast forward to present day. In 2024, the hunt for family members is given over to investigators with the Los Angeles County Public Administrator's Office. The home of a 74-year-old Korean woman who died in October 2023 in the hospital and remained unclaimed was visited in an effort to find any clue to a family member's address. If these persons had a home, many times they are cluttered with hoarded trash or broken belongings. This makes the search twice as hard as the investigators go through correspondence or anything that can offer a clue, protecting themselves with a mask, latex gloves, and Tyvek suits. Since Los Angeles has the nation's largest homeless population, they are always busy. In December 2023, the last burial of unclaimed and unnamed bodies from the Emmy's office numbered 1,937. The number has been steadily increasing every year. Now let's go, same scenario, but we're in New York. In 2014, the New York Medical Examiner's Office was described as a mess. Bodies were lost, cremated by mistake, or wrongly donated to science. Millions of dollars of taxpayer money was spent on equipment and plans that could only be implemented in the case of a mass disaster, instead of the daily workings of the ME's office. Between 2004 to 2014, $19.6 million was given in federal Homeland Security grants. The department did not release records of how those funds were spent, and is suspected they were wasted. The department has a history of criminality, waste, and incompetence. That's a quote. And this is another story about something that happened there. Quote, the ME's former Chief of Management Information Systems, Natarajan Raju Venkataram, and his co-worker girlfriend Rosa Abreu were busted in 2005 for embezzling more than $9 million from 11.4 million FEMA grant meant to track and identify remains of 9/11 victims. Excuse me. And bosses take lavish taxpayer-funded trips to conferences and symposiums. Frank DePaolo, Assistant Commissioner for Emergency Management, has traveled to Las Vegas, The Hague, Hong Kong, and Israel. Chief of Staff Barbara Butcher has gone to Croatia and Thailand. The two bosses have embarrassed the agency. Days after 9/11, Butcher took home a Ground Zero souvenir, a jet exit door handle she remarked would make for good conversation on the coffee table, a witness reported. She gave it back, but could not recall to whom. She was promoted and got a pay hike to $166,879 a year. in her talk about taking a morbid, conversation piece. De Paolo, who made $160,380 in 2013, left a laptop that held 200 to 300 photos of body parts from 9/11 and other victims and city disaster plans in his agency-issued SUV. The computer was stolen from the vehicle. I'm telling you. End quote. In 2014, the New York ME's office found an elderly woman's corpse in the morgue where it had been for nearly a year. Another body was sent for cremation in her place. Leah Lehrer, died in January of 2014, aged 95, in her apartment. Her family had buried what they thought were her cremated remains in a Queens cemetery. It's believed the remains that were interred belonged to Rebecca Alper, 71, who died by suicide in September 2013. When a relative inquired about Mary Alper in May 2014, the ME could not find her body. They hurriedly dug up 300 graves from the Potter's Field on Hart Island, which turned up nothing since in reality she was cremated and buried in a grave in Queens under another woman's name. A colleague of Lehrer said she had worked for New York Life up to her death and traveled to Tunisia alone in her mid-80s. Quote, she was a wonderful person, highly intelligent, very curious, and very kind. She cared about other people. End quote. Lehrer had no siblings and was childless. She told relatives she wished her ashes to be buried in her parents' gravesite in Middle Village. It's unknown why Lehrer's body was held for so long, since normally unclaimed bodies are sent for city burial within 2 to 3 months. The mishandling of Lehrer's remains was blamed on a boondoggle body tracking software program that cost taxpayers more than $10 million. I'm telling you. So this poor lady who actually had a family and left, her last wish is known, like bury me, cremate, bury me with my family. They stick her somewhere, I guess, in some refrigerator. And take the body of a suicide, cremate that, and turn it over to the family, and that's the one that's. Let me tell you, that's incredible. So, yeah, talk about what do they call it? And the taxpayers are paying for it. Yay! Anyway, let's go on to the next story. This is also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this is titled "The Unquiet Spirits of the Somme." All right, let me get my phone before it starts going crazy back here, because I know that's what's going to happen, because I get notifications all the time. All right, let's see. All right. The Somme offensive was one of the biggest, bloodiest battles of the First World War. It is little wonder then that ghosts have been reported on the haunted Somme battlefield. The First World War, also known as World War I, lasted from 1914 to 1918. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip on June 18, 1914, along with rivalries and nationalism, contributed to the war. The Somme offensive was fought between July 1st to November 13, 1916, on both sides of the upper reaches of the River Somme in France. In the first day, 68,000 lives were lost, making it a very bloody battle. In the aftermath, the Somme was seen as a senseless slaughter of men. 3 million men fought, and more than 1 million were killed or wounded. With so much loss of life, it is little wonder that many of those who died there do not lie quietly in their graves. On November 5, 1916, the whole area around Albert in Picardy, France, thundered with artillery and the sound of gunfire. The British 2nd Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment were being fired upon by a small German force who intended to overrun the trenches they occupied. Captain W. E. Newcomb sent an official report where he described an event he had personally witnessed. He described a brilliant white light rise from the muddied ground between the armies. The light lengthened and filled out into the figure of a British officer, which soon became recognizable as Lord Kitchener. His face was well known since he was pictured on the recruitment posters. The regiment was one of Kitchener's own. It wasn't just a strange place to see Lord Kitchener, it was the fact that he was dead. He had died 5 months before while traveling on the HMS Hampshire en route to Russia to attend negotiations with Tsar Nicholas II. The ship hit a German mine 1.5 miles west of Orkney, Scotland, and sank within 20 minutes. He was one of 737 lives lost that day, and his body was never recovered. No Man's Land was lit up by flares, and the figure of Lord Kitchener was seen to walk parallel to the trenches. Then he turned to face the Germans, and their firing stopped as he walked over 1,000 yards, looking first this way then that. Then shells started to drop on No Man's Land in defense of the British troops. In the chaos, the specter of Lord Kitchener was lost. Another story that appeared in Pearson's magazine in August of 1919 described the following, quote, Mr. William M. Spate, who had lost a brother officer and his best friend in the Ypres salient in December 1915, seeing this officer come to his dugout the same night. The next evening, Mr. Spate invited another officer to come to the dugout in order to confirm him should the vision reappear. The dead officer came once more, and after pointing to a spot on the floor of the dugout, vanished. A hole was dug at the indicated spot, and at a depth of 3 feet there was discovered a narrow tunnel excavated by the Germans with fuses and mines timed to explode 13 hours later. By the discovery of this mine, the lives of a number of men were saved. At Thiepval, a memorial with 73,367 names of missing British soldiers who had no known graves was raised. Their bodies were never recovered from the surrounding countryside. Present-day identical white headstones populate a rural landscape which disguise what happened to the village of Thiepval and the carnage that occurred there in September 1916. A year later, William Orpen and Henry Geoffroy were sent separately to produce artwork based on the scenes from the Western Front. In November 1917, Orpen came to Thiepval Wood. Wow. The battles had stopped, but skeletons dressed in ragged uniforms littered the ground. Despite a strange sense he was not alone, he placed his canvas in the easel and painted for 2 or 3 hours. Even though the sun was shining, he felt overwhelmed by feelings of extreme fear, so he took a seat on a blasted trunk of a tree. Without any warning, something unseen rushed at him, and he was flung backward. As quickly as the entity made its presence known, it disappeared. He struggled to his feet and found his unfinished painting was destroyed. The canvas had been smashed upon the skull of a soldier. He warred whether to keep painting or leave. He decided to stay, and though the feeling of dread continued, he was not interrupted again. Not long after this event, he was in conversation with fellow painter Henry Geoffroy. Orpen didn't describe his ghostly experience, but did mention that one of the British skulls had an unusual cleft in the jawbone. Geoffroy asked him if he could take him to the woods so that he might make a study of Thiepval Wood. Orpen dropped him off and returned a few hours later with lunch. He was astounded to find Geoffroy lying on the ground away from his easel. Later, Geoffroy said the smell made him feel ill and there was a gleaming eye in the skull socket. Orpin didn't know what to make of this story, since there was no odor of death and all the skeletons were only bleached bone. The artist's experience turned the artist's experiences turned out were not unheard of, as others who had visited areas around the Somme battlefield had similar encounters. Deville Wood in Longueval, France, was the scene of intense fighting in 1916 between British and German soldiers. Heavy casualties were suffered by both sides. Visitors to the mill hear whispers, disembodied cries, and see shadows as well as apparitions of civilians and soldiers. Many believe the suffering experienced by the soldiers has imprinted itself in the land. The Memorial Sud Africain de Longueval, located within Delville Wood, serves as a tribute to the South African soldiers who fought and died there. Once a rider walking through the Nairn Street trench felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and a male voice whispered into his right ear, "We're still here." A very haunted spot is the Mamet's Wood, which is avoided even by the locals who grew up in the area. They have heard bugle calls and the sound of battle. There's a statue of the Drago Gauche, or Red Dragon, holding a piece of broken barbed wire, a memorial to 4,000 soldiers of the Welsh Division who were almost wiped out in July 1916. Not only was there fierce machine gun fire, but hand-to-hand combat. The regiment had recently been created, and for many of them this was their first taste of war. People walking from Flatiron Cemetery up to the Dragon Monument report feelings of being watched by many eyes, which makes them very uneasy. The Lair Infanterie Regiment also suffered high losses and could not be deployed again until September 1916. Another area haunted by phantoms is the Danger Tree. On July 1st, 1916, a whole male generation of Newfoundland and Labradors were wiped out. The Newfoundland Regiment were sent over the top along with the British Essex soldiers of the 29th British Division on an order that meant almost certain death. The Germans shot at them as they crawled through a gap in the barbed wire. There was no cover for them, and they had to cross 750 yards as machine guns opened up on them. In the morning, only 68 of 810 were alive. Those visiting the area describe a sensation of dread and deep sadness, this or desperation to get away from the place. Sergeant George Thomas Hunter with the 10th Corps Australian Expeditionary Force was wounded in July 1916. He was flown to Peterborough in England, where he died on July 31st, 1916. He was buried in Broadway Cemetery. He was born in Durham, left to Australia in 1900, and in 1914 worked in the mines in Broken Hill, New South Wales, before he joined the military. The First World War Infirmary building where he was nursed has changed and is now the Peterborough Museum. Along the corridors and a specific staircase, the ghost of Sergeant Hunter has been spotted. After hours, docents hear footsteps pacing in empty rooms above their head. When they go to investigate, there is no living person there. Visitors to the museum describe feeling an icy hand grab their shoulder from an invisible presence. This is a story experienced by someone who visited the battlefields of the Somme. Quote, "I went to the battlefields of the First World War on a school trip. We stayed in a youth hostel in Belgium close to the French border. I was in a room with some of my closest friends. The first night we arrived at the hostel, it was quite late and we went to bed pretty early. I remember feeling really cold in the room, but everyone else said they were warm. But we all got to bed and went to sleep pretty easily. I woke up in the night at about 3 o'clock in the morning. I could hear the sound of a battle all around me. I remember hearing gunshots and explosions and cannon-like booms. At first I thought that the TV was on, but there was no way it could be that loud. I was really scared and I could pick out screams and crying among the artillery fire. Then they just stopped suddenly. I hope it was my imagination. The next day we traveled to Ypres, and I had a great uncle to find in Ypres Reservoir Cemetery. He was a member of the King's Royal Rifle Corps and died in the Third Battle of Ypres, apparently. Well, I found him. I started to cry as I stood in front of the grave. All I had was a measly poppy to give him, and I felt bad after all he'd done for his country and family. Then I felt a warming presence around me that comforted me. It calmed me down and stopped me from crying. It made me feel contented and warm. The only way I can describe it is that it felt familiar. I had to move on pretty fast because everyone else was waiting on the bus for me. We moved on to the more famous sites like the Menin Gate and Passchendaele, but I felt the presence following me. From one site to the next, I felt like it was there near me. One of my friends commented that I looked a bit distracted and kept looking behind me all the time. The presence was still there when I went to sleep the second night at the hostel. Nothing happened that night. I didn't hear the noise, but when I woke up, I thought I saw an outline of a person by one of my friend's beds. The next day, when we were all awake, I asked my friend if any of them had gotten up in the night, and they all said no. They asked me what was up, but I couldn't tell them because they'd think I was weird. But I had a good friend in another dorm room who I would tell. He believes in the paranormal like me, and is the only one I can talk to about this. But he is a male friend, and I wasn't allowed in his room at that time. I managed to grab a seat next to him on the bus going to the Canadian trenches. I told him what had happened to me since I arrived at the Somme. I could still feel the presence around me, and I told him this as well. We all arrived at the site and had a look around. The trench system is not what it used to be, but you can still stand in it and have your head covered. I didn't like going through there because I felt uncomfortable. It had been raining for the past couple of days, and the trench was really muddy and wet. It was drizzling slightly when we were at the Canadian trenches. I hung at the back of the group with my friend, and he took pictures of everyone. Later on, when the photos were developed, there are lots of white spots around all of us. But my friend decided he wanted a photo of me, and the rest of the group had gone off to explore. But behind my friend appeared a figure of a male soldier. It was fuzzy at first, but came into focus as he got closer. I was really terrified, and I looked it too, and my friend noticed. He looked behind him, and he saw the man too. I saw him fully then, and I saw that nearly all of his right arm had been blown apart. This frightened me so much, I legged it away from there, and my friend followed me. My friend had seen the man too, so I wasn't going insane. I'm still petrified whenever I think of the man. I didn't sleep at all that night in the hostel. I still felt the presence, but it felt a bit distant that night. The next day, our last visit was to the Old English front line. Nothing happened there, but we started the journey home after that. When I got on the ferry, the presence seemed to disappear, and I've never felt the same presence at home. End quote. So yeah, that's very sad to see such the loss of so many lives. That's like incredible. Incredible. War is a bad thing. Very bad thing. Okay. Next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, is titled The Valentine's Day Ritual Murder. On a cold February evening in 1945, the body of 74-year-old Charles Walton was found in a field of the Firs farm, in which he had been working earlier that same day. He was considered a recluse, and no one who lived in the Warwickshire hamlet could understand who would want to kill him, much less mutilate him. Charles Walton was known to be a quiet man, and a loner who shared a thatch-roofed cottage opposite the village church with his niece in the hamlet of Lower Quinton. Despite suffering from rheumatism and using 2 walking sticks, he worked on and off doing odd jobs and lived off his small pension. His reputation as an honest, hard-working farm laborer left the authorities puzzled as to who would want to kill him, especially in such a brutal manner. On February 14, he left early in the morning to continue trimming hedges in a field called Hillground. This was the last time his niece saw him alive. A sickle-like farm tool known as a slash or billhook was used to cut his throat 3 times, with wounds so deep he was almost decapitated. His skull was split, 3 ribs were broken, and his body bore evidence of a terrific beating. Nearby lay one of his walking sticks with hair and blood on it. The ultimate mutilation was a pitchfork thrust through the lower part of the face, which pinned the body to the ground. The handle was wedged under the hedge. The head had been tilted backward in order to drain the blood from the severed arteries, the hook still buried deep in his neck. His money belt was loose, his clothing unbuttoned, and his braces undone and broken. The only thing missing from Charles Walton's belongings was a cheap metal pocket watch which he was known to carry. Some accounts further claim that a crude cross-shaped symbol had also been carved into his chest. However, the autopsy report did not reflect this. This rumor could have come about since it was believed that carving a cross into a witch would nullify their power. Such was the case that was dubbed the witchery case. 15 miles from Lower Quinton was the village of Compton. In September 1875, Ann Tennant, a 79-year-old woman, the wife of a pig dealer, was coming home after visiting the village baker. James Hayward, a farmer, was returning home with his father-in-law when he ran up to her and with a pitchfork stabbed her several times in both legs, and then hit her about the head with the handle of the fork. A neighbor came and seized Hayward. Others took the woman to the house of her daughter, where she died shortly afterward. "I'm being taken into custody," said to the constable. "I hope she's dead. She was an old witch. There are 15 more in the village. I'll serve the same. I mean to kill them all. A few days ago I was 3 hours in a bean field and could not work, as they had witched me." He was charged with manslaughter, but found to be criminally insane and spent the rest of his life at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Hayward might have been crazy, but he was expressing deeply held beliefs from those who lived in the area for generations. Lower Quinton, where Walton lived, was a rural village with a population of only a few hundred that dated back to the 16th century. Thatch roof cottages surrounded a church and local pub, and further out were a few farms. In a place where everyone knew their neighbors, and a stranger would have been noted, it was unusual indeed that there were no suspects or leads in the crime. Local authorities asked Scotland Yard for help. Their message read that the, quote, murder was either committed by a madman or one of the Italian prisoners who were in a camp nearby, end quote. Chief Inspector Robert Fabian, a well-known detective, and his partner Albert Webb were tasked with finding the killer. They would go on to interview and inspect a nearby POW camp that held Italians who were allowed to come and go as they pleased, but nothing was found to connect anyone to the murder. They looked hard at Alfred Potter, who owned the land where the murder had taken place, and was the last person to have seen Walton alive. There was also a question if he owed Walton money, but he was soon cleared. It's believed that Fabian considered him the strongest suspect at the end of his investigation. The detectives investigated the state of Walton's finances, and there was an irregularity that was never explained. Walton's wife left him a sum of £297 when she died in 1927. This was quite a considerable amount for those years. He was known to have placed it in a building society, but during the murder investigation, the balance was only £2, and I don't know how to read the rest of this. A little bit over £2. Known as a frugal man, he spent no more than £2 per week. About 60 shillings was found in his house, but the remainder was never accounted for. The detectives were surprised that not a single person volunteered any useful information. The pair interviewed just about every one of the 500 or so residents of Lower Quinton, and ended up with more questions than answers. Fabian noted, quote, "There were lowered eyes, reluctance to speak except for talk of bad crops, a heifer that died in a ditch. But what had that to do with Charles Walton? Nobody would say." End quote. The detectives were also puzzled when none of the villagers expressed fear that they might be the next victim of a madman. A telling encounter was when an elderly villager shouted at the detectives before slamming the door in their face. "He's been dead and buried a month now. What are you worrying about?" Of one thing the detectives were certain: the village of Lower Quinton was keeping a formidable secret, and there was only one way to learn the truth, and that was to look into Charles Walton's life. In order to understand the customs of the region, Fabian read The Folklore, Old Customs, and Superstitions in Shakespeare's Land from 1929, authored by J. Harvey Bloom, a local clergyman. What Fabian found was a description of folk stories and superstitions with a dark flavor that permeated the area. It seemed that there was a long history of witchcraft in the county, which might have been more subtle, but which had deep roots in the community. The detective could not help but see the ties between the ritualistic overtones of the crime and the beliefs that still thrived in the area. Was this a conspiracy that kept the community evasive about the murder? At first blush it seemed far-fetched, but other details pointed that there was more truth to the theory than originally thought. Charles Walton was originally described as a solitary and peculiar man, but it seemed he had another darker reputation. It was said he possessed certain powers such as second sight and the ability to communicate with spirits. Since his youth, he was known in modern parlance as a horse whisperer who could tame horses with his hand or eyes. It was said he could also communicate with birds and dogs as well. According to one witness's account, quote, Walton had been seen on many occasions imitating the songs of the nightingale and chirping to other species of bird. He openly professed to be conversant in the Aeolian language of his feathered friends, for they seemed to obey his request to refrain from eating the seeds sown in the field of his little plot. End quote. Mention of Charles Walton was documented in J. Harvey Bloom's book, in which he wrote, a plow lad named Charles Walton, who met a black dog on his way home 9 times in successive evenings. On the ninth encounter, a headless lady rustled past him in a silk dress, and on the next day he heard of his sister's death. According to the neighbors, this encounter stained Walton's soul, as documented by Bloom. Already seen as a gifted child, he was imbued with a darker cast, such as having the evil eye and being able to curse others. There were those who whispered he was a witch. Strangely, after the murder, when Walton's home was searched, his garden was full of large natterjack toads. Rumors were quick to spread that he was breeding them for use in occult practices, since toads were known to be a witch's familiar and a tool in cursing. Isabel Gowdy, an illiterate cotter's wife and a self-proclaimed Scottish witch, was tried in 1662. She confessed to fastening miniature plows to toads and loosing them in the local fields in order to sterilize the ground. This confession was produced without the use of torture. Prior to Charles Walton's death, the crop season was dreary, and Lower Quinton was badly affected, leaving some to blame the old man for blighting the harvest. One of Walton's former employers described what the old man had done to blight a field. Quote, Old Charlie used to catch a toad and tie a toy plow to its legs and have it run along towing the thing across a field. End quote. The detectives were left with an uncomfortable scenario in which Charles Walton had been murdered by a group of vigilante farmers who believed he was to blame for their bad crops. It was a difficult thing to prove, but Fabian realized the Cotswolds region was still steeped in superstition, and it was not a far-fetched possibility. Beliefs discarded in other parts of England, like tales of demonic entities, headless horsemen, and ghostly women, still held sway there. In March 1869, it was reported in the newspapers that in the hunting fields of the North Cotswold, as described by eyewitnesses, Lord Coventry was out with a hunting party, and the hounds were heading towards Meon Hill, when they came upon what was found afterward to be a poisoned rabbit, which they began to eat. Soon 3 from the pack dropped dead. Close by was a dead fox, which had also been poisoned. One of the dead hounds and part of the rabbit were sent to London to be analyzed, which resulted in the finding the rabbit was set out as a poison trap. Meon Hill, a stone circle dating back to Neolithic and the Bronze Age, where remnants of Iron Age and Roman settlements had been found, were close to the murder scene. Even from these ancient times, the area was associated with dark supernatural forces. It was supposedly the inspiration for Weathertop and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The Celts believed the hill was where Arwan, lord of the underworld, with his company of spectral hounds, rested. His task was to gather departed souls every night, therefore travel at night was strongly cautioned against, since witnessing Arwan's hunting party was a portent of impending death and doom. Once the Christians came to the land, Meon Hill is where the devil took up residence. When Evesham Abbey was built in the 8th century, it was said the devil kicked the boulder down the hill. However, St. Ecuene saw it incoming, prayed, and it fell to the ground and became Meon Hill. There's another variation to this in which only the prayers of the faithful diverted its trajectory. It came to rest on Cleve Hill near Cheltenham, where the villagers carved it into a giant cross to ward off further attacks. Robert Fabian included the following in his memoir, Fabian of the Yard, quote, On the hilltop around Lower Quinton are circles of stones, where witches are reputed to hold Sabbaths, and it was under the shadow of Meon Hill, not far from the stone circle of Whispering Nights, that on Valentine's Day of 1945, a rheumatic old man was found murdered. End quote. Another folk tale takes place in a nearby field known as the Close, which sits atop an ancient earthwork site. It is told that a young man from Long Compton signed a pact with the devil by drawing a circle on the ground and reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards. In exchange for his soul, he was gifted with 12 imps as his servants. At the Banbury Fair, he summoned a demonic spirit in the form of a black rooster. In Fabian's memoir, he mentions that stone circle of Whispering Nights, which are megaliths known as the Rollright Stones, dating back to 2500 BC, and which are a few miles from Meon Hill. They are the King's Men, a circle of 77 large stones that were used for ceremonial purposes. The King's Stone, a single monolith that is north of the King's Men, and the Whispering Nights, which are 5 upright stone that lead in towards each other to the east. The rollright stones are said to be what remains of a Viking king and his army, which were cursed after they angered a local witch known as Mother Shipton. Charged with supernatural force, it is said that on certain nights the men are released from their curse, and at the stroke of midnight they come to life. They go to drink water at a nearby spring and join hands to dance. Fairy folk who live in caves underneath the stone circle join them in the festivities. The king stone is seen as a phallic symbol, where local women who were unable to conceive would visit on a full moon night and rub their naked breast against the stone, resulting in a baby 9 months later. The stone circle is also where witches would gather. In the 16th century, a witch hunting team from Oxford investigated reports of coven activity at the site. 100 years later, a witch from Little Rollright was charged with attempted murder using black magic. She was accused of attending Sabbats at the Rollright Stones and Board Hill, which is outside of Oxford. She was sentenced to hang. It is rumored that Charles Walton, as a child, would steal out to the mysterious Rollright Stones nearby and watch witch rituals. In 2015, a well-furnished burial was found of a young Saxon woman near the Kingstone. The grave had no coffin, and she was put in the earth around the 7th century when England was converting to Christianity. She was aligned north-south in a shallow grave. One of the items in the tomb was a copper alloy skillet left by her head. A circular embossed silver disc inlaid with a single garnet was probably set into the base of the skillet. There is also a silver sheet decorative mount with a crescent-shaped plate. The skillet is a rare find and it is remodeled on the Roman trullium and used in hand-washing rituals. A large rock crystal bead still attached to the remnants of a chain lay on the left side of the body. Crystal beads were usually found in the burials of high-status Merovingian and Anglo-Saxon women of childbearing age and were a conspicuous sign of wealth. The discovery of the grave confirms that the area had special significance, perhaps as a portal into the afterlife, since it was used since prehistoric time for burials. Another unusual factor of the Walton murder is a superstition of what is known as a black dog. Whether it's seen on a lonely highway, on the outskirts of a village, or in a fog-shrouded cemetery, the connotation is always negative. Some believe they are demonic spirits or the ghost of murdered or executed individuals who haunt the place of their death. They are universally seen as cursed entities and harbingers of misfortune. During the Walton investigation, Robert Fabian found himself in the vicinity of St. Swithin's Cemetery, close to Meon Hill. It caught his attention when he saw a black dog on a nearby stone wall that watched him closely. He looked away, and when he looked for the animal, it had disappeared. He left the field and came across a boy. He asked him if he was looking for his dog. Once he specified he had seen a black dog, the boy paled and ran away. Soon the village heard of the encounter and that the detective had seen the ghost. To cement the superstition, the following morning a cow dropped dead while grazing in the field. As Fabian continued his attempt to interview villagers, he noted in his memoir that when he walked into the village pub that evening, silence felt like a physical blow. Cottage doors shut in our faces, and even the most innocent witnesses seemed unable to meet our eyes. Some became ill after we spoke to them. A few days later, a black dog was hung from a tree near where Charles Walton's body was found earlier in the week. Fabian considered it might be a sick prank or a warning. He would write, quote, that we realized for certain that we were up against witchcraft, end quote. Perhaps it was these events that led the detective to believe Charles Walton was a sacrificial victim in a ghastly climax of a pagan rite. Strangely, the same evening a police car ran over and killed a similar dog in a lane near the village. Margaret Murray, a professor from University College in London and an expert in European witchcraft, took an interest in the Walton case. She believed the old man was killed as a way to replenish the ground with his blood. According to Murray, quote, the belief is that if life is taken out of the ground, it must be replaced by a blood sacrifice, end quote. What information is known about Iron Age Britain has been gleaned from Roman historians and archaeological digs. Both sources point to ritual sacrifice as being an important part of the Celtic magical religious system. Inanimate objects, animals, and on occasion humans were the victims of ritual murder, especially in times of famine or pestilence. Celtic druids were known to burn people in wicker effigies, as well as strangle, drown, poison, stone, behead, dismember, and bury their victims alive. The druids practiced what was known as a threefold death, in which the individual dies at the same time in three ways, either by drowning, hanging, or strangulation, wounding, throat cutting, or head injuries. The Celts were known for their fascination with the number three. The intent was to ensure maximum bloodshed to appease the gods. Bog bodies such as Lindau man were found to have evidence of throat cutting, strangulation, and blunt force trauma. He was not a slave or a captive. The healthy young man had hands that were smooth and his nails were manicured. It's believed he was an aristocrat but not a warrior, since he didn't have any battle scars. According to Anne Ross and Don Robbins, British archaeologists, he was a Druid prince who came from Ireland about 60 AD when the Romans were conquering Britain and ending Druidism. They believe he was a willing sacrifice offered to help defeat the Roman legions. He had dark red hair and a full beard like a Druid, and his only adornment was a circlet of fox fur. They claim his name was Lavernius the Foxman. He was furiously bludgeoned 3 times about the head, then garroted by a 3-knotted sinew cord, which compressed the jugular vein. Either of these attacks would have killed him, but at the point of death a long, thin blade was plunged into his throat to insanguinate him before he was symbolically drowned. There was mistletoe pollen in the victim's stomach, which is strongly associated with the Druids. It is a poisonous plant known to cause convulsions, and is unlikely to have been ingested accidentally. The event that led to the discovery of Lindau man was a macabre find unearthed in 1983. A severed woman's head was found by commercial peat cutters working near Lindau Moss, an ancient bog. Police responded, and it seemed there was a local man who was a suspect in the disappearance of his wife 20 years before. They questioned him again, alluding to the grisly find. Peter Ryan Bart confessed that he had indeed raped his wife, then killed and dismembered her in the Lindau Moss bog. He was convicted of his wife's murder, even though no trace of her body was found. Ironically, it turned out the woman's head didn't belong to his wife, but a woman that was put into the bog 1700 years before. In 1984, a leg was found, but this time it was an archaeologist who responded and went on to find the well-preserved body of an Iron Age man. The Druids believed that when the winter was ending and the earth needed to be reawakened, it should be replenished with life-giving blood. The timing of the Walton murder corresponded to the Celtic midwinter festival of Imbolc, based on the old pre-Gregorian calendar. 3 years before Charles Walton was murdered, another occult-related killing was unearthed in nearby Worcestershire. It was April 1943 and World War II raged throughout Europe when 4 English teenagers were hunting for birds' nests in a private estate near Birmingham named Hagley Wood. Inside the hollow of a tree they found a woman's skeleton. It was hard to judge how she was killed, but a piece of taffeta stuck in her mouth was believed to have asphyxiated her. It was estimated she was killed in October 1941. Next to the tree were the bones of one of her hands, which had been severed. She did not fit any reports of missing persons, and there was no match to her dental records. Also, due to the war, there was a large amount of strangers that had come to the area, which could account as to why they could not identify her. 7 months after the discovery of the body is when the graffiti started. The first read, "Who put Lubella down the witch elm?" It was followed by Hagley Wood Bella, but the one that stuck was "Who put Bella in the witch elm?" There were several theories as to who Bella was, but soon rumors of black magic were whispered in connection to the murder. Margaret Murray, an expert in folklore and witch cult, suggested Bella may have been killed in an occult ceremony, the removal of the hand typical of a black magic execution. Leaving the body in the hollow of a tree was believed by occultists would prevent the spirit from causing harm, especially to the person who put them there. She was quoted as saying, "The very act of placing a body in the hollow of a tree is associated with witchcraft. The cult of tree worship is an ancient one, and it is linked with sacrifice." The decade slipped away, and in 2009 the case was officially closed. When the files were turned over to the Worcestershire County Archives, Bella's bones were missing. James Webster, a forensic expert, had inspected them in 1943, and afterward they disappeared from the records. Some believed it was a cover-up, but ultimately without her remains there was no way to run DNA tests. In 1950, Margaret Murray, who visited Lower Quinton, said of the village, quote, "I am almost satisfied that it was a witchcraft-related murder. It is typical of those places where superstitions and beliefs in witchcraft still exist. One significant thing is that it occurred on St. Valentine's Day, February the 14th. In the pre-Christian era from which many rituals still live, February was a sacrificial month." In 1952, the Birmingham Psychic Research Society had made plans to visit the site of the murder in February. However, the expedition was canceled when they couldn't find a medium who would take part in the seance to contact Charles Walton. One of the members of the society said, "We were anxious to go, but the mediums we knew would have nothing to do with it." An official from the group said he had discovered something about Charles Walton. He said, "In an old county magazine of the 1870s, I found the cutting about a young plowboy named Charles Walton. He had been set upon by some Warwickshire villagers after he had told them he saw an old woman in black behaving mysteriously in a lane. It is very strange. Was Walton psychic?" It's not known if this was the same incident referred to in J. Harvey's book from 1929. It wasn't until November 1952 that the seance was carried out halfway up the slopes of Meon Hill. They finally had a medium who accompanied the group across plowed fields, barbed wire fences, muddy ditches, and puddles of icy water. Shortly after they began, a blizzard began and sleet fell. H.R. Mills from the society accompanied Mrs. Higginbotham, the medium, who went into trance and said, I forgive, I deserved what was coming to me, but not in such a brutal way." After 10 minutes of other unintelligible muttering, the seance ended. The medium had started to channel the dead man not 50 yards from the white gate by which the body was found. They left and trudged back 2 miles to their vehicles. Detective Chief Superintendent Spooner of the Warwickshire CID would visit Lower Quinton and the scene of the crime every year on St. Valentine's Day. After Fabian and Webb had returned to London, he kept investigating the crime. He would go on to say, quote, "The more I visit the village, the more I am convinced that Walton died in some black magic ritual," end quote. He remained convinced that the killer was a local man. In August 1960, an event occurred that reopened the case, which at that time was only 15 years old. Charles Walton's missing watch was found. A building worker found it in what used to be Walton's back garden at 15 Upper Quinton. At the time of the murder, an old shed stood on the spot. The question was whether Walton had lost the watch or if the murderer slipped into the shed and left it there, since it was an incriminating piece of evidence. Inside the watch case was a piece of colored glass. The villagers opined this was a piece of witch glass used to deflect or absorb evil thoughts directed at the owner. Oddly, the police had searched the shed right after the crime and found nothing. Why would the killer have risked returning it here instead of disposing of it some other way? Charles Walton was buried in St. Swithin's Cemetery across the road from where he lived for many years. His tombstone disappeared, perhaps done on purpose, or it was lost when the churchyard renovations were completed 50 years after his death. No one can recall exactly where he was buried, since there is no surviving family. Like the murder of Bella in 1943, the case of Charles Walton remains unsolved. There was never a deathbed confession or overlooked clue that came to light, which was Robert Fabian's hope, since this was the one case he didn't solve. So what do you think? Something really weird, because let's face it, somebody gets killed, okay, but that was that no pun intended, that was overkill, all that they did to him. Especially, he's an old man, rheumatic, he uses 2 walking sticks. This man couldn't defend himself. Like, there was no need to do all of that. So yeah, I do believe that there's something there. Okay, we're off to Mysterious Universe, and this is titled Mysterious and Fascinating Cryptid Beasts and Monstrous Creatures of the United States. The United States is without a doubt one of the greatest and most fascinating countries in the world, made up of multiple locations of natural beauty, lush ancient forest, expanses of desert and countryside, all sprinkled with metropolis-like cities and towns, each unique and like nowhere else on the planet. It is also home, even if we take Bigfoot encounters out of the equation, to all manner of cryptid creatures, some more legend than fact and others abundantly documented and recorded. Perhaps the best example of a blend of legends and documented encounters can be found in accounts of the Jersey Devil, with debate still continuing if such a creature is nothing but folklore, if it could be an unknown species that has inhabited the northeastern United States, specifically what used to be the open plains of New Jersey. The legends of the Jersey Devil stretch back to the early 18th century, with the first written account appearing in 1735 with announced pregnancy of Pine Barrens resident Jane Leeds. This pregnancy was in fact her 13th, and legend offers That she stated clearly to anyone who would listen that the devil can take this one. Further, according to legend, when this 13th child was born, it was in the form of a human, but with the features of a reptile, with claws instead of hands and feet, horns on its head, and a tail. This apparent beastly child would grow remarkably quick. In fact, some accounts even talk of it being no less than 20 feet in height, although apparent modern-day sightings of the Jersey Devil speak of a much shorter being. Eventually, the reptile-like child left the Leeds house through the chimney and disappeared. Even since, there have been sightings of what would become known at first as the Leeds Devil and then eventually the Jersey Devil. It is very likely that the origins of the legends of the Jersey Devil go back to a pilgrim, Daniel Leeds, who records attest arrived in Burlington, New Jersey from Leeds in Yorkshire, England in 1677. Like many who ventured to the New World of America, he was a member of the Society of Friends, perhaps better known as the Quakers. As well as being a devout follower of his religion, Leeds also had a great interest in paganism, including its many rituals and practices, as well as being highly educated in such ancient arts as astrology and even alternative medicines and ointments. It was this interest in perceived heretical beliefs, at least in part, that eventually led him to being shunned by the Quaker community. It was also worth mentioning that Leeds was loyal to the British, which also made him a target for the Quaker aggression. It is likely, then, that it is from the Quaker community of New Jersey's shunning of Daniel Leeds the legends of the Leeds Devil came from. It's also interesting to note that the Leeds family crest was of three dragon-like creatures, which only cemented suspicion in the eyes of many of the local New Jersey community. As the population in the New Jersey region grew following the discovery of bog iron, which led to many towns and eventually cities sightings and accounts of the Jersey Devil also grew. Perhaps one of the most fascinating comes from Commodore Stephen Decatur in 1800. During a visit to the Hanover Iron Works so he could test the cannonballs being produced at the plant, he reported witnessing a strange winged creature flying directly over the firing range. 2 decades later in the same region, the brother of Napoleon, Joseph Bonaparte, was hunting game when he claimed to have seen a very similar winged creature. These sightings continued sporadically throughout the 19th century, with people even hanging lanterns above their front doors in an attempt to keep the mysterious beast away. In 1899, though, an apparent wave of sightings of the New Jersey Devil unfolded, many of which are documented in Monsters of New Jersey, Mysterious Creatures in the Garden State by Loren Coleman. Arguably, the first of these took place on the evening of January 16th in Woodbury. According to the account, an unnamed man was walking out of a hotel when he heard a sudden hissing sound coming from overhead. When he looked up, he claimed to have seen a white creature flying over the road. What's more, as it did so, it turned to look at the man with glowing eyes. Later that night, into the early hours of January 17th, in nearby Burlington, Joseph Loudon and his family reported hearing strange sounds outside their homes, as if there was some heavy body trampling snow in the yard. After several minutes, whatever was responsible for the noise began circling the property, even attempting to gain entry through the back door. Then, with no explanation, the creature suddenly left. When the Loudon family dared to go outside a short time later to investigate, they could see clear, beast-like footprints in the snow right the way around their home. Incidentally, on the same evening, a resident of Gloucester City noticed similar footprints in the snow outside their house. They followed them across several properties before they disappeared into a junkyard. Around 24 hours later, in the early hours of January 18th, the Loudon family reported further strange discoveries when they found the same beastly footprints in the snow outside their house, this time leading to the garbage cans, its contents strewn along the ground as if someone or something had been riffling through it. Sightings continued daily, reaching well into double digits over the coming days. Mr. and Mrs. Evans from Gloucester City, for example, reported seeing the Jersey Devil sitting on their shed after being dragged from sleep at around 2:30 in the early hours of January 19th. Mr. Evans later described the figure as being round 3 feet tall and having a head like a collie dog and a face like a horse, as well as having wings about 2 feet long on its back. When he opened the window in an attempt to scare it off, the creature made a barking-like sound in his direction before flying into the air and disappearing. The following day in Burlington, a police officer claimed to have seen the strange figure whose eyes were like blazing coals, while in Morston, John Smith witnessed a monstrous creature that he reported was around 3 feet in height with long black hair over its entire body, with arms and hands like a monkey, and a face like a dog. He further stated it had a long tail and hoof-like feet. What's more, Smith actually gave chase to the creature until it disappeared into some kind of pit. As well as sightings of this menacing winged creature, many local farmers began reporting attacks on their livestock and poultry, with some reporting that their animals had been killed. By January 22nd, the whole region was worked up into a state of panic hysteria. Then, just like that, they suddenly stopped, quite literally overnight. There had been no explanation for this or what the creature might have been. And while such a wave would prove to be unique, sightings of the Jersey Devil continued throughout the 20th century right into modern times. One night in 1972, for example, Mary Christensen was traveling toward the town of Glassboro along Green Tree Road in southern New Jersey when she noticed a strange-looking creature in her rearview mirror approximately 25 feet away. The description of this creature was remarkably similar to those during the 1899 wave. Specifically, it had a head like a horse and legs similar to a goat. Furthermore, she claimed this creature stood upright and had wings that appeared to be made from leather stretching from its back. Mary didn't waste any time in pressing down hard on the gas, and she quickly left the creature behind. Another unsettling encounter unfolded just under a decade later. One day in 1980 in the Wharton State Forest in the Pine Barrens region, Alan McFarland, a forest ranger, was on his way to a farm he had received a call to attend. Upon arriving, he was confronted with the sight of the farmer's pig, all of which had been butchered during the night. The pigs had deep claw marks along their backs, but what was most unsettling was that each of the backs of the pig's head had been half eaten. To McFarland, this grim scene pointed an equally grim scenario, that whatever had attacked the pigs had clawed on their backs while essentially eating their brains. Furthermore, given that there was no other wounds anywhere else on any of the pigs, this appeared to have been a purposeful, targeted move, perhaps suggesting more intelligence than your average wild animal. Incidentally, the incident remains unexplained. Another disturbing encounter unfolded several years later, when a group of friends were camping in the Pine Barrens woodlands as they enjoyed a dirt bike riding holiday. On this particular day, as they were riding through the forest, each of their bike engines suddenly came to a stop. What worried them more, however, was the inhuman scream that they suddenly heard coming from the forest. Not only was the scream not human, it was also unlike any animal any of the group had ever heard. So unnerved was the group by the scream that they all left their bikes where they were and ran back to the camp. Although they returned for their bikes a short time later, some of the campers opted to leave the forest early and return home. Those who remained heard the terrifying screams later that evening. Of course, you can only guess that the screams belonged to the Jersey Devil. In much more recent times, in October 2015, Dave Black claimed to have not only seen the Jersey Devil making its way over a New Jersey golf course, but he managed to capture a picture of a mysterious figure. He claimed that as he was driving along Route 9 in Galloway, he noticed something strange that he at first thought was a llama. As he watched the creature, though, it suddenly spread out leathery wings and flew over the golf course. Black faced considerable criticism over the picture and his claims, but he insisted that he was not seeking any kind of monetary compensation for the pictures, only to see if anyone could offer a rational explanation as to what the creature was. When asked for further details about the creature he had seen, Black offered that it was similar to a flying mammal about the size of a deer. Whether this was a genuine sighting of the Jersey Devil or nothing but a hoax remains open to debate. There are many other cryptid creatures and monstrous beasts in the United States. As detailed in the book Real Monsters, Gruesome Critters, and Beasts from the Dark Side by Brad Steiger, arguably one of the most disturbing of these is the beast of the Cascade Tunnel, a Bigfoot-type creature with glowing yellow eyes who is said to reside most in the abandoned Cascade train tunnel in the Cascade Mountains in Skykomish, Washington. One particularly unsettling encounter featured Dave, who had made his way to the tunnel in order to investigate the reports for himself, as well as to get some photographs of the abandoned rail network. Remarkably, he had barely walked 40 feet into the tunnel when he noticed two bright yellow eyes, which he would later describe as no normal animal eyes, a short distance ahead of him. He stopped and stared back, noticing the vague outline of a beast-like creature that stood out at least 10 feet tall. Deciding he had seen enough, Dave slowly turned around and ran to the entrance of the tunnel. As he faced as he raced along, he heard a loud metallic boom coming from behind him. He didn't look back. Several days later, though, he returned to the tunnel once more, and this time he had several other people with him. To everyone's surprise, all present saw the creature and the glowing yellow eyes for themselves. What the creature might be remains a complete mystery. Another similar creature, known as Orange Eyes of Ohio, is said to roam the underground tunnel systems of the Buckeye State. Similar to the creature spotted in the Cascade tunnels, this beast from Ohio, as its name suggests, has glowing orange eyes and is said to stand around 10 feet tall, with approximations on its weight settling somewhere around the 70 stone mark. What perhaps gives the legends of the creature a further edge is that many offer that it originates from the tunnels under the Riverside Cemetery in Cleveland. Under construction work forced it from its habitat and into the wider area. The first recorded sighting of Orange Eyes was in 1959, when three teenagers saw the bizarre figure on the roadside as they drove home one night. Many similar sightings came over the following decades, with many motorists even claiming the creature would jump out from the roadside, causing them to swerve. The last recorded sighting of Orange Eyes was in 1991, when two fishermen claimed to have seen it lurking near Willis Creek. Whether this curious entity still resides beneath Ohio in the vast tunnel network remains unknown. There are similar legends of a tunnel-dwelling figure from South Carolina, with a being known as the Third Eye Man. According to the book Haunted South Carolina, Ghosts and Strange Phenomena of the Palmetto State by Alan Brown, rumblings of the Third Eye Man stretch back to the mid-19th century, with a general legend being that this bizarre man-like figure roamed the tunnel systems that stretched out from the University of South Carolina college campus. The first recorded encounter with this mysterious man, though, wasn't until November 12, 1949. On the night in question, at around 10:45 p.m., two college students were walking past the Longstreet Theater, where they saw a manhole cover in the middle of the road being moved out of place. They were both more than shocked to see a bizarre man wearing a silver suit emerge from the manhole before disappearing quickly back into the tunnels below, even pulling the manhole cover back into place as if nothing had ever happened. One of the witnesses, Christopher Nichols, was a budding journalist with the Gamecock publication. This was the university newspaper, and he would write an article on their encounter, dubbing the figure at the time the Sewer Man. For several months, off the back of the article, there was a buzz about this strange figure, with many contemplating who or what he might be. This initial buzz, however, died down just as quickly. That was until another encounter was reported. While patrolling the grounds of the university on the evening of April 7, 1950, a local policeman stumbled onto two chickens, each of which had been slaughtered. The remains were near the loading docks, which were incidentally close to the Longstreet Theater, the location of the previous sighting. Thinking the killing of the chickens was some kind of prank by university students, the policeman ventured over to his car in order to report it. When he returned to the spot of the grim discovery, though, he was met with a sight he wasn't ready for. There, directly in front of him, was a strange man wearing a silver suit. What's more, the man stood motionless, simply looking down at the carcasses of the dead birds. The policeman reached for his flashlight and shone the beam directly at this mystery man. When he did, he almost stumbled back in shock. Not only was the man's skin a bizarre silver-gray color, almost identical to his suit, but in the middle of his forehead was a third eye. Almost as soon as he saw this, the policeman turned and ran back to his patrol car as fast as he could. Once there, he requested immediate backup. Only when the backup arrived did the policeman get back out of his car. When the officers walked back over to the location where the man had been standing, he was no longer there. All that remained were several stray feathers and a pile of bones. Needless to say, the officers who arrived on the scene following the request for backup believed their colleague had seen something. They thought that he had likely hallucinated the silver man with the third eye due to fright. This wasn't, however, the last sighting. Although the exact date is uncertain, on one October evening in the late 1960s, several male students made their way to the steam tunnels on campus in order to take part in a fraternity initiation ritual. Before the ritual got underway, however, the strange silver-suited man appeared, as if out of nowhere. What's more, he was carrying what appeared to be a lead pipe in his hand as he charged towards the petrified students. The group immediately turned and ran, taking cover in the tunnel entrance. Before they could reach the tunnel, though, one of the students called out that the man had got a hold of his leg. He clambered as hard as he could, his friends tugging on his upper half, and eventually, despite suffering several cuts to his hands and face, he managed to free himself from the man's grip. The students would report the incident to the local police, and off the back of this report, the legend of the Third Eye Man takes a strange and perhaps suspicious twist. It is unclear if local law enforcement took the report seriously or not. What is clear, though, is that a short time after the encounter, the entrances to the steam tunnels were sealed shut permanently. Not only are students forbidden to enter these tunnel systems, but anyone caught doing so faces immediate suspension from the university. Make of that what you will. Much more beastly than the Third Eye Man is the Billywhack Monster, said to call the abandoned buildings of the Billywhack dairy plant in California home. This beast-like creature is said to be covered in white hair and has ram-like horns on its head, as well as razor-sharp claws. Ultimately, the best description of this monstrous creature is that it's half man and half sheep, and by all accounts it is remarkably aggressive and predatory. Most of the reports of this creature come from the 1950s and 60s, although random and sporadic, still surface today. These reports are usually from adventure seekers who find themselves at the old dairy plant, usually as part of some kind of dare. There have been several suggestions put forward to explain this fierce creature, with perhaps the most persistent being that it's a result of some kind of government experiment from the Second World War, an apparent attempt to create a beast-like super soldier. According to these suggestions, the creature escaped its military confines in the years following the war, finding a refuge of sorts at the old dairy plant. Also in California is an aquatic creature known as the Elizabeth Lake Devil, which is said to reside in the waters of Elizabeth Lake. While there have been no recorded sightings of the alleged lake monster since the mid-19th century, the legend still lives on and remains strong in the local area. According to the sightings that are on record, this creature is not only winged but has 6 legs, a neck similar to a giraffe, and the head of a bulldog. According to local records, many people from the area, in light of the many sightings of the 1800s, sold their property and land well below the asking price in order to vacate the area, with some allegedly even abandoning their homes altogether. Yet another cryptid creature can be found in California under the bridge that crosses the Santa Ana River. This creature, sometimes referred to as the Riverside Monster, is said to have long arms and razor-sharp claws, with legs that extend sideways from its body. Strangely, it is said to have a head like that of a scarecrow, with glowing eyes. The last recorded sighting of this creature was in November 1958 when a local man named Charles Wetzel was driving home. As he approached the Santa Ana Bridge, the car's radio suddenly began to break up into a cacophony of static. As he twisted the dial, attempted to clear the radio, something leaped into his vehicle out of nowhere, staring directly at him before attempting to claw through the glass. Wetzel eventually slammed on the brakes, causing the creature to fall from the vehicle. He quickly slammed on the gas, driving over the creature as he made his escape. When his car was examined later, there were unexplained claw marks on both the windshield and the car's underside. On the other side of America, in the Everglades of Florida, although sightings have been reported as far west as Texas and as far north as Kentucky, we find legends of the Miyake skunk ape, sometimes called the Miami or Florida skunk ape. Although general descriptions of the skunk ape are similar to a typical Bigfoot or Sasquatch creature, the skunk ape is said to be much more similar to an orangutan or chimpanzee. It is claimed that the Florida swamplands are its preferred habitat, and it can move extremely quickly, making them difficult to spot. Furthermore, and again, similar to Bigfoot, it reports an unpleasant odor is said to accompany the skunk ape, hence its name. Perhaps remarkably, there have been numerous photographs captured of the skunk ape, as well as several quite convincing pieces of video footage, suggesting that whatever it might be, either a Bigfoot-type cryptid creature or simply a troop of wild chimpanzees who have made a home for themselves in the Everglades, perhaps after being freed, there is most definitely something roaming this part of Florida. Without a doubt, one of the most intriguing cryptid creatures of the United States is that known as the Dogman, with many of the sightings coming from the state of Michigan, which sometimes leads to the name the Michigan Dogman. In fact, according to the book Traveling Michigan's Sunset Coast by Julie Albrecht Royce, one of the earliest recorded sightings in the Wolverine state occurred as far back as 1887. On the day in question, 2 lumberjacks working in Wexford County spotted what they at first thought was a dog roaming around near where they were working. In part, To break away from their work for a while, the two lumberjacks began to pursue the dog. However, it soon found refuge in a hollow log. In an attempt to entice it out, one of the lumberjacks poked a stick into the log. A moment later, a blood-curdling scream came forth, quickly followed by the dog. Only it wasn't a dog. It was a monstrous creature that stood upright. The two lumberjacks looked at this figure in shock. They would later recall that it had the body of a man, but the head of a canine. After coming to their senses, the two men turned and ran as fast as they could. What followed was an encounter with a Michigan dogman every 10 years from that point. In 1897, for example, a farmer in Buckley was discovered dead in his plow, seemingly from a heart attack. However, when huge dog tracks were found leading to and then circling the body, questions were raised as to just what the farmer might have encountered to have caused such a heart attack, not least as these canine-like prints suggested something that walked upright and not on all fours. 10 years later, in 1907, a widow, although it doesn't say exactly where, began reporting having weird dreams of dogs that walked like men circling her house during the night. She also claimed these dogmen yelled like banshees. While these could have been nothing more than strange, intense dreams, some researchers have questioned whether they were in fact another encounter with a dogman, perhaps multiple of them. In 1917, an even more harrowing incident unfolded. A sheriff, again the exact location is not given, discovered an abandoned wagon with strange dog prints all around it. Despite searching the area, no driver was ever discovered. They did find, though, the 4 horses used to pull the wagon. All dead, seemingly from fright with their eyes wide open, although no medical reason were established for their deaths. 2 decades later, in 1937, there were at least 2 separate sightings of these apparent dogmen. A captain of a boat stationed near Bowers Harbor claimed his crew had told him of seeing a strange pack of large wild dogs roaming in the area on several occasions. Later in the year, while on the banks of the Muskegon River, Robert Fortney claimed to have been suddenly set upon by 5 wild dogs. He managed to shoot and kill one of them, causing all but one of them to run off. The one that remained reared up on its hind legs and stood upright, staring at Fortney with slanted yellow eyes. Eventually it backed down and disappeared, presumably to the rest of the pack. Although he reported the encounter, he was well aware of the dogman legends and did his best to distance himself from such reports. That said, he later admitted that dogman, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a dog, best described exactly what he saw. There were other noteworthy encounters with the Michigan dogman as the second half of the 20th century unfolded. In 1957, for example, a priest discovered claw marks on his church door, just like those a dog would make. However, unlike a dog, these claw marks were at least 7 feet high on the door, beyond the height of any dog. Another decade passed before the next noteworthy encounter occurred in 1967. On this occasion, a van of hippies claimed that they had been woken in the middle of the night by a dogman who had been attempting to gain entry to the van they were sleeping in. One of the more recent encounters featured 2 fishermen who were fishing from their boat one evening in Manistee. As they were casting their lines, they noticed some kind of strange animal swimming in their direction. To begin with, one of the fishermen thought it was his pet dog that decided to swim to their boat. However, the closer it got, the more they both could make it out. The creature did indeed have the head of a dog, but it had the body of a man. What's more, this creature was not swimming in the fashion of a dog, but was doing the front crawl just like a person. The 2 fishermen immediately began swinging their oars in the creature's direction until it finally swam away. Even more recently, during a cold winter night in 2009 in Shelby, just before midnight, C. and Laura Love, a retired police officer, were driving along US 31 when they had their own encounter with the Michigan dogman. Love later recalled that they saw a large, tall, dark, and oddly shaped creature just run out from the roadside and hit the rear quarter panel of the small truck that was in front of them, causing them to slam on their brakes. As they stared out of the windshield, there in front of them was a dark, furred figure that stood upright at a height of around 7.5 feet. The figure looked at them briefly before taking off into the night. Arguably, one of the most interesting sightings of the Michigan dogman occurred one evening in 1961, not least as it resulted in one of the few photographs of this alleged cryptid creature. The incident unfolded at around 3 a.m. one night in Big Rapids, while a night watchman at a manufacturing plant was on his patrol duties, largely from the porch of his house directly opposite the plant. As he was doing so, he heard a sudden rustling sound coming from the fence at the edge of the plant. Assuming it was someone playing a prank but not prepared to take any chances, he withdrew his gun from its holster, all the while keeping the area of the fence where the noise was coming from in sight. After a few moments, something began to move out of the shadows of the fence. The night watchman remained still as the figure stepped into the light. Although its body appeared human-like, the witness immediately noticed it was much taller than the average person. Furthermore, it was covered from head to toe in dark fur or hair. Strangest of all, though, its face was clearly that of a dog, with a particularly long snout. The creature, seemingly unconcerned with the witness, made its way along the fence, switching from walking upright to moving on all fours as it did so. One of the first officially recorded encounters with a dogman outside of Michigan, at least in the 20th century, occurred in 1936 in Racine, in the neighboring state of Wisconsin. The account is documented in the book The Beast of Bray Road by Linda Godfrey, and featured a night watchman, Mark Shackleman, who was doing his rounds at the St. Coletta convent where he worked. On this particular evening, Shackleman witnessed what he described as a canine-looking creature scratching at the land of a Native American burial ground close by. The night watchman approached the strange creature, who was further described as having particularly long claws. However, it fled the scene as soon as it noticed him. When he investigated the land where he had seen the dog-like creature, the following morning he discovered several dog-like footprints and claw marks on the ground. When he reported to work the next evening, his patrol duties took him past the same spot he had seen the mysterious creature, and once more he saw the dogman again, scratching and clawing on the ground. He approached it just as he had done the previous evening. However, instead of fleeing, the creature stood upright, staring directly at Shackleman, who later recalled the creature was at least 6 feet tall. Then things turned even stranger. As this curious beast stared at the night watchman, the sound of a single word came from its mouth. Shackleman wasn't sure if it was a name or an order, but he recalled the word was Gadara. Not knowing what else to do, Shackleman slowly turned around, and as calmly as he could, he simply walked away. By the time he looked back, the dogman was no longer there. Also related in The Beast of Bray Road are two encounters that took place in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, on the road after which the book is named. The first unfolded at around 1:30 a.m. one night in the fall of 1989, when Lori Andreezy was driving home from the Elkhorn Lodge, where she was the manager. As she drove along the quiet road, she suddenly made out a dark figure kneeling at the roadside with its back to her approaching vehicle. Although it appeared human, from this angle she could not tell whatever it was. It had short pointed ears and very much like a wolf or a dog. Lori continued on toward the creature, and several moments later it turned to face her. She could see that although it had the general body of a man, its face was most definitely canine. She later recalled that its elbows were up and its claws were facing out. Claws, incidentally, that she further described as long. What's more, in its claws, it appeared to have some kind of roadkill. As she continued on, the headlights of her car made its eyes reflect brightly. Although she only caught a brief glimpse of it, she guessed it was just under 6 feet tall and was the weight of an average adult. What really unsettled her, however, was the fact that it simply stood at the roadside, staring defiantly at her, as opposed to running away, as one might expect a wild animal to have done. Lori offered that there was a most definite intelligence to it, and that the creature was more human than animal. She also stated that she believed it was satanic, adding that while she doesn't really believe in werewolves per se, I believe something could be conjured up. Of course, whether this is the case or not remains open to debate. What is known is that Lori would make a report of the sighting to the Walworth County Animal Control, a report that was entered into the official record as werewolf. It was, however, one of many reports of the strange creature on the stretch of road. Just over 2 years later, on Halloween night, 1991, another sighting of the alleged Beast of Bray Road, or the Dogman, was reported. On this particular evening, Doris Gibson was driving through the night fog on her way to pick up a friend from a party. Suddenly she felt a thud that caused her to lift momentarily off the ground. She knew immediately she had hit something and brought her vehicle to a stop. She walked to the front of the car, expecting to find a small deer or other unfortunate animal. To her mild surprise, however, she found nothing. Thinking whatever she hit must have moved itself off the road, she set out back to the car. The next thing she knew, a huge figure came surging toward her out of the fog. This creature was standing upright and had the body of a man, and a muscular one at that, but with a canine-like face. She quickly threw herself in the driver's seat, started the engine, and pressed her foot down hard on the gas. As she was doing so, she felt a little resistance. As she looked around, she could see that this monstrous creature had grabbed onto the rear bumper, clawing at the car with its other appendage. Eventually, she sped off into the distance, leaving the creature behind. Even more amazing, after having picked up her friend, they both saw the same creature, although this time from a distance on their journey home. Another account documented by Linda Godfrey occurred in September 2008 in Fitchburg in Madison, Wisconsin. At around 2 a.m. on the night in question, a college student, known only as Matt, was up late when he heard a bizarre sound coming from the walls. A sound he claimed sounded like bubble wrap being popped. The next thing he knew, there was a thunderous sound of the birds all flying from the nearby trees at once, which was followed by what felt like small earthquake tremors. To begin with, Matt thought the tremors were the end of the strangeness, and so went back to what he was doing. Then, however, came another sound. Just as Matt had almost forgotten about the sounds of the tremors, a horrific scream pierced the early morning hours. At first, Matt thought someone had been hurt following the earthquake, even though it was just a minor one, and so he quickly made his way outside. The screaming came again and again. Now certain someone was in need of help, Matt continued up the road. Then he noticed the headlights of an approaching car. More interest and concern, the headlights illuminated a strange humanoid figure. Only this figure had the head of a wolf. At the same time, the screaming suddenly stopped, and a moment later, the figure disappeared into the nearby woodland. Matt claimed to have heard the scream randomly throughout the night. Whether there was a connection between the earthquake and the appearance of the strange creatures perhaps opened to debate. Of course, if there was, then we might contemplate if the dogman could perhaps be supernatural in nature. It is certainly worth keeping on the collective back burner. One of the most recent sightings of the dogman occurred on November 7, 2016 in Duluth in Minnesota. On the night in question on Maple Grove Road, an anonymous woman witnessed a strange canine-like creature running upright under the lamppost of a residential area before disappearing into a nearby field that housed an old barn. She later described the figure as being around 7 feet tall, elaborating that it moved with a hunched back. She also offered a detailed description of the face, claiming it was wolf-like, with a particularly long nose and pointed ears. She further stated that the creature moved stiffly, almost similar to the movements of a gorilla. At this point, she pressed down hard on the gas and drove to a nearby gas station. When she was certain her husband would have arrived home from work, she drove back to her house. As soon as she arrived home, she blurted out what she had seen. Eventually, she told her wider family of the incident, and what was more than shocked to find out, her sister had seen what she described as the very same creature several years previously standing near her house and staring straight at her. As we can see, then, the United States is littered with many cryptid beasts and monster-like entities from coast to coast, and the ones we have explored are just some of the many documented encounters from just some of the many strange creatures that seemingly live out in alternative existence, side by side with your average American, only occasionally, relatively speaking, their respective paths crossing. Of course, whether any of these creatures exist or not remains open to debate. As we explore whether belief alone could be strong enough to make something real, we could very well find that legends of such creatures as the Jersey Devil or the Dogman suddenly become very real for those who experience them, and that sightings of anything unexplained are quickly attributed to such creatures of folklore. That said, many of the encounters we have explored contain remarkable detail and descriptions, perhaps beyond those of panicked witnesses, subconsciously filling in the mental blanks. What if, though, these aren't figments of the imagination, but legitimate real-life creatures? The next question we would have to ask ourselves is if these are flesh and blood, beasts, and unknown species, or if there is something more supernatural in their origin. The truth is, the answer could be both. Like Bigfoot creatures, many of these creatures, while sometimes photographed, are never caught. In fact, many of them seem to disappear, almost in thin air, as quickly as they appear. Could it be that while these creatures are very real, they are temporary visitors to our realm of existence, perhaps from another dimension, the result of dimensions crashing into one another and temporary portals or gateways opening? While this is huge speculation, it is certainly intriguing and perhaps possible. Or could they be manifestations based on energy? In this case, the pure energy of belief, and the fear and other emotions that come with it. If there's any truth to electromagnetic energy and the life energy, emotions, etc., playing a part in the manifestation of such strange entities as ghosts or aliens, then might that be the case for cryptids? We might think that if a population of a certain region holds a collective belief in something, then that energy will tap into that and manifest in the form of those beliefs. I was speaking to the great researcher and writer Steve Mera about just such a point a couple of summers ago, and he offered how it was interesting that in all of these encounters, even when people claim to be chased by such entities, they are never caught and harmed. Anything in nature, a wild animal for example, upon catching whatever in its chase will kill it. These entities, be it Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, or the Dogman, never do. Even in cases when the apparent victim is cornered rather than go for the kill, the respective creatures often turn and run. Mera offered that this could be a case of these creatures not only manifesting from our collective beliefs, but of then feeding off our fear and terror. It is certainly something to keep in mind. And Marlene's theory on that is that perhaps we just don't find the ones that have been caught. The victims that have been caught and eaten and killed. In other words, yeah, there's eyewitnesses saying, yeah, I saw this, I was chased by that, or whatever. And no, they're never caught, yeah, because the ones that are caught are done away with. So anyway, I will be back with you soon with some more eerie news because God knows there's plenty of it coming around. Till next time.